Hello, my name is Paola Serafini. I'm a research associate at Cameo Research Institute for Cultural and Media Economies at the University of Leicester. I'm very happy to share this um, very quick slice of some research I'm carrying out at the moment. Actually, this is going to be part of a book I'm writing based on ethnographic research I did on extractivism and cultural resistance in Argentina. And these are just some thoughts and examples that are part of a chapter on territory and art. So I'll just share some of those thoughts that go into that chapter with you. So this chapter is concerned with the idea of territory and territoriality. And therefore, I think it's important to kind of start thinking about what territory means, because it's a word that's usually used without giving much thought to it and how it's used in different contexts. So from the 1970s onwards, in Western scholarship, authors like Soya, Zak, and Painter, for instance, have advanced understandings of territory along social lines, arguing that territory is a relational practice and that it stretches beyond political boundaries, kind of moving away from other previous definitions that were focusing more on the political. However, it is important to acknowledge that these perspectives and these theories were still rooted in a Western paradigm, and therefore when we're looking at places like Latin America, they might have their limitations, especially because territorial conflicts in Latin America are often also ontological conflicts, where different conceptions of territory and different worldviews collide. In Latin America, the framing of struggles around territory became widespread towards the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 90s, and it was embodied in the demand, "We don't want land, we want territory," espoused by indigenous, farming, and Afro communities. A bit later, the Zapatista movement in Mexico further contributed to the surge of territorial struggles with its vision of the relation between territory and dignity, placing territory as a basis for the reproduction of life. Territory thus becomes a concept that can be mobilized politically, as well as a practice that goes beyond the frameworks of the state. The second point to make is a relationship between the idea of territory and extractivism, which is obviously quite a close one, because extractivism serves to describe precisely the historical form of territorial organization imposed by capital, not only in Latin America, but in other parts of the world. And it's actually a concept, extractivism is a concept that allows us to understand global dynamics of territory, the connection between the territories of extraction and the territories of the accumulation of capital. So Machado Arauz, for instance, explains that through the dynamics of primary export-oriented investments, inhabited land becomes occupied land, or in other words, capital provokes a process of deterritorialization and displacement of local people, their economies, and social fabric. For indigenous peoples whose ancestral territories are under the threat of extraction, fighting for territory is also the fight for the right to exercise a worldview, again, what we were talking previously about, the ontological aspect of the territorial struggle, and the right to sovereignty. Thinking about territory and struggle and extractivism, we must also consider the idea of the territorialization of movements. So how do movements become more and more concerned with territory as a core value and a core object of struggle? So while territory and insurgent spatial practices have always been part of social mobilization, we could say, this became more and more prominent in the mid-20th century and has recently gained even more centrality for a lot of struggles. So someone who's done a lot of work on this issue is Raul Sibeki, and he says that territorialization is about having roots in spaces that have been recuperated or otherwise secured through long, open or underground struggles. It is a poor response to the deterritorialization of production and the displacement of popular sectors into new territories brought about by neoliberalism. So his study is very much rooted in the Latin American perspective. He talks about territorialization as social agents' response to the processes of dispossession of capital, and in this case we could say of extractive capital or extractivism. And finally, the other concept I wanted to discuss before moving on to the examples and to a more visual part of this presentation is the ecoterritorial term. which I think pretty much brings together all of these ideas to the contemporary context we are facing and the challenge of extractivism. So in the context of an expansion of the extractive frontier, in the last 2 decades, socio-environmental movements in Latin America have begun to build a language of valorization of the territory, which Maristela Svampa describes as an ecoterritorial term. This term involves the convergence of different matrices, including the indigenous community organizational form and the autonomous narrative, autonomy being a very central concept in Latin American social movements. It also involves a focus on the environment, and more recently, and with great force, a feminist perspective. And the combination of these elements has facilitated the construction of common frames for collective action, argues Svampa. Having considered those concepts, I wanted to turn briefly to the idea of territorial work, because basically what I propose in this paper and this chapter that this paper is part of is that when we look at creative resistance in the context of extractivism, both urban and rural, we can look at creative practices from an interdisciplinary perspective that brings together the social and political aspect and the aesthetic. So what I'm going to propose is looking at these practices, the practices I will present in a moment, as both territorial work and site-specific work. So I will explain what that means. The term trabajo territorial or territorial work is associated in Argentina to the picotero organizations like Movimiento de Trabajadores Empleados de Solano. So piqueteros were this movement of unemployed workers that emerged in the late 90s and then gained a lot of force around the 2001 financial crisis. And they were quite territorial in their approach to organizing, their approach to protest, which was heavily based on blockades. But then later on, piqueteros and other people started organizing to create neighborhood assemblies following the 2001 crisis. And these were assemblies made up of neighbors that started to address the urgent needs of people, from the economic to the social and the cultural. So things that territorial work encompasses are, for instance, popular kitchens, health assistance, cultural activities, and solidarity economies. And what distinguishes these kinds of assemblies is that they're often non-hierarchical and in many ways anti-capitalist. Their work is based on an ethics of care, and it follows a situated approach that responds to the needs of a particular territory. And then there's site-specific art. So site-specific art is art that is created for a specific location and that responds to the specificities of that site. But here, again, we must think of site and of place in a social manner, in a relational manner, and in a broad manner. So that site is not only the physical space where an artist or a group of artists create a work, but site also refers to the wider, for instance, social, political, or environmental context. A site can be an issue. A site can be the framework of the art world. It can be the framework of crisis. So site means doing work that responds to something, but it can be both spatial and intercultural. Some kinds of site-specific art, in addition, engage with local communities by adopting participatory processes that allow participants agency in the development of the work and to use art as a way of exploring and or transforming their connection to a space. And we're going to identify this dynamic in some of the work I'm going to present now. So the first example I wanted to share was an exhibition that took place in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, a couple of years ago, that was called Arte en Territorio, so Art in Territory. The exhibition brought together the work of a range of artist collectives that work with different communities and within different territories, including mural painting with children in a hospital, photography projects where young people produce images of their own environment, and a project for the legal recognition of a space that is already actually functioning as a community cultural center in an open space. The exhibition adopted a relational understanding of territory that is socially constructed and constantly in flux. And the exhibits that we could see in this exhibition can also be read as site-specific art and territorial work simultaneously. So to show you an example, this is the cultural center. It's called Centro Cultural a Cielo Abierto Armando La Bollita. So it's an open air cultural center in the city of Buenos Aires. And the issue with this center is that it has been functioning for a while, providing cultural and social activities for the neighborhood, but it hasn't been recognized yet. So the participation of this collective in that exhibition was a way of making that claim to the state to recognize the kind of territorial work that was already taking place, as the activities that they organize, the family support, the educational activities are already providing a service to the community, but this is just not being recognized yet. And the other example is a project called Ojo de Pez, which consists of providing young marginalized people with tools to photograph their environment, their city, to make records of their daily experiences, and to reflect on the social issues that condition their lives. So it is a project that aims to provide young people with skills that could offer employment opportunity, with skills for expressing themselves, but also with skills to better understand and articulate their lived realities in the urban territory and what is needed in order to change that reality. Finally, it's also a project that aims to democratize the public narrative on what cities are like, to challenge some ideas of the city and some imaginaries of the city that completely invisibilize marginalized experiences. Another example I wanted to share is the collective mapping of iconoclastistas, which is actually quite recognized internationally. Iconoclastistas is made up of Pablo Ares and Julia Risler, they're a duo, and they were formally conceived in 2006 with the intention of providing visual resources for the communication practices of political and cultural organizations and social movements. They developed the methodology of mapeo colectivo, or collective mapping, as a way of collecting and locating popular situated knowledge about socio-environmental conflicts, and began touring Argentina and later on other countries in the region in 2008. So what they would do would be, what they still do, is getting in touch with environmental assemblies across the country who might be interested in this kind of knowledge and this kind of process, and they would go there and they would explain to people how they do things. They would learn from each other, they would facilitate a space for mapping, and then they would put their skills in communication and in design to the service of that community that needs to map, for instance, different episodes of pollution or different episodes of police repression in a certain part of the country. And then that information is turned into a map that's made available online, and it's open to anyone. And what's interesting is that they differentiate themselves from previous practices of what was called social cartography, because they really emphasize that this is not a top-down process, but rather a collective horizontal process in which the local people have the agency of what the map is going to do, how it's going to be done, and what the objectives and the use of the map are. So what we can see on the left is an example of the process of mapping, and on the right we can see one of the recent maps called República Tóxica de la Soja, or Toxic Republic of Soy, which is about the expansion of agribusiness in Argentina. So the final example is specific to the region of Patagonia. So Patagonia, you have the Chilean and the Argentinian Patagonia in the south of the continent. And it is often seen, or it has since the beginning of the conquest of the continent, of the colonization of the continent, been seen as the last frontier, and played a significant role in the definition of imperial modernity. And this colonial conception of Patagonia is sustained until today. So the region has become increasingly attractive for international capital in a bet to expand the extractive frontier in the form of open pit mining and also oil extraction, more recently including fracking. But in recent years, as the expansion of the extractive frontier moves forward, we have seen also increased resistance from indigenous peoples, including the Mapuche people, who are progressively challenging the political understanding of territory upheld by the Argentine state, as the territories and ways of living are under increasing threat. So something that came out of this resistance was this installation by an artist called Hugo Fernando Chandia. And I think it's a very relevant installation to be talking about today, given the bringing down of monuments that's happening right now as part of the Black Lives Matters movement. So this took place in 2017 in the city of Esquel, and it was a multi-site intervention that brought to light the violent colonial history of Argentina and the present violence of extractivism. It was titled La barbarie sobre la civilización, or barbarity over civilization. And what the intervention explored was the conquest of the desert, which is the name given to the process, the military campaign by which Patagonia was basically incorporated into the Argentine territory, and thousands of indigenous people were killed in the process. So one of the parts of this installation, which was actually multi-sited, was the monument of Perito Moreno, which was one of the early kind of scientists and explorers to do work in this region. And the installation filled the place with skulls to make reference to the killing of indigenous people during the so-called conquest of the desert, but also the killing of people right now. And what's interesting is that another site that was intervened was the Rural Association, which is a current organization. And what the artist wanted to highlight was the complicity of economic actors right now in the continued oppression of indigenous people and in the threat that they experience in their territories. I'm running out of time, so yeah. So I propose that Chandia's work can be understood as site-specific because he is mapping out, kind of highlighting and doing an in situ mapping of these sites of power. So the Rural Association, Moreno's monument, also references to Roca. And in this way, he's trying to re-signify the space and engage in an act of re-territorialization. So reconfiguring what that space, what that city feels like, and highlighting the violent aspects of history that we still in Argentina uphold to this day. You know, these monuments are still up there and are not recontextualized. Streets are still named after the general who led the campaign, etc. So my concluding thoughts, very briefly, are that the practices presented here represent cases where artistic practice and social political action merge. And this is something I've developed in previous work, which I actually forgot to put in the references, but you can look it up if you're interested in that. Also, that applying the frame of site specificity allows us to understand this practice is art and to understand the relational aspect as both ethical and aesthetic. The concepts of territorial work, territorialization, and the eco-territorial turn, on the other hand, allow situated appraisal of how these kinds of practices are embedded within anti-extractivist, decolonial, and social justice movements. The practices presented here allow instances of denunciation. Through collective work and the collectivization of the creative act, many of these works allow instances of artistic democratization as well. And finally, through intervening in the territory, some of these works also allow instances of territorial reconfiguration or re-territorialization. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And if you're interested in any of these issues, I'm happy to answer any questions.